The training grounds of the Naval Special Warfare Compound were alive with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. Rows of hardened men, their faces marked by scars and discipline, were lined up on the range, their rifles gleaming under the mid-morning sun. These were Navy SEALs, the best of the best, men forged through fire, war, and impossible standards. Their bodies were carved by years of training, their reflexes sharpened by missions most civilians could never dream of. They stood shoulder to shoulder, quietly competitive even among themselves, as they prepared for another day of grueling exercises. On the far edge of the field, however, stood someone who did not belong. A small figure, a girl no older than 12, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail, her wide eyes fixed not on the intimidating men around her but on the rifle racks at the end of the line. She had been brought there reluctantly by her father, a retired SEAL who now served as an instructor. He hadn't planned on her tagging along, but she had begged, insisting she wanted to see how real warriors trained. The men noticed her almost immediately, smirking among themselves, nudging one another at the absurdity of the sight. A little girl at a SEAL firing range, it was almost laughable. One of the younger operators, tall and broad, leaned on his rifle and grinned. "Hey kid," he called out, his voice mocking but not unkind, "you lost? This isn't a playground." Laughter rolled through the line like a wave, the sound deep and confident. But the girl didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her small boots crunching on the gravel, and pointed toward the targets in the distance. "I want to fire," she said clearly, her voice neither trembling nor meek. For a moment, silence followed her words. Then came the roar of laughter, louder this time, filling the air. Some bent forward clutching their sides, others shook their heads in disbelief. "She wants to fire?" Another SEAL chuckled. "Sweetheart, those rifles are heavier than you are." The girl's father sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. He hadn't wanted this scene to play out, but his daughter was stubborn, and once her mind was set on something, there was little anyone could do. He opened his mouth to call her back, to tell her no, but she turned and met his eyes with a fire he knew all too well, the same stubborn fire that had driven him through Hell Week, through the endless mud crawls, the drown-proofing tests, and the bone-breaking missions. That spark froze him where he stood. "Please," she said softly to him, but there was steel beneath the word. He hesitated, then nodded slowly, more to himself than to her. The laughter died down as he walked her toward the rack, the men still shaking their heads, amused at the spectacle. He picked up a rifle, an M4 carbine, its weight intimidating even for seasoned shooters, and laid it gently into her small hands. The men expected her to buckle under the weight, to drop it instantly, but she adjusted her stance, planted her feet, and braced herself just as she had watched him do countless times in the backyard with training sticks. She raised the rifle, her arms trembling slightly, but her eyes narrowed with focus. The chatter ceased. There was something about her expression, too calm, too deliberate, that made even the most dismissive among them pause. Her father crouched beside her, adjusting her grip, guiding her finger near the trigger. "Only if you're sure," he whispered, testing her resolve one last time. She nodded firmly. The instructor gave the all-clear, and the range fell into silence. The girl inhaled slowly, exhaled, and squeezed. The rifle barked loudly, the recoil jolting her back, but she steadied, corrected her aim, and fired again. The first round punched near the edge of the target. The second struck closer to center. The third hit dead on. A ripple of disbelief moved through the line of SEALs. The girl fired again and again, each shot tighter, more deliberate, until a cluster of holes blossomed in the bullseye, tighter than many of the men had managed earlier that day. She lowered the rifle, breathing hard but smiling faintly, her cheeks flushed. The range was utterly silent, the mocking grins gone, replaced by stunned stares. One of the men muttered, "No way." Another shook his head, his voice low and incredulous. "That's impossible." Her father said nothing, only watching her with a complicated expression of pride and worry. He knew this was only the beginning. What she had just done wasn't luck. He'd seen it in her before, in her coordination, her focus, her unshakable will. The girl had just shattered the unspoken line between ridicule and respect, and though none of the men would admit it yet, she had captured their attention in a way no one else ever had. The stillness that followed her last shot lingered heavily over the firing range. No one spoke, no one laughed, and the girl stood in the silence as if daring them to deny what they had just seen. The Navy SEALs, men who prided themselves on discipline, marksmanship, and the ability to crush obstacles, were suddenly unsure of what to make of her. Their instincts told them this was an anomaly, a fluke, a trick of chance. Yet, the tight cluster of bullet holes on the target said otherwise. Finally, one of them stepped forward, a veteran named Briggs who had more deployments under his belt than most of the men there. His voice was gravelly, his tone skeptical but edged with curiosity. "All right, little one," he said, folding his massive arms across his chest. "That was cute. But one lucky string doesn't mean anything." The others murmured their agreement, regaining some of their swagger. They needed to prove, if only to themselves, that their world hadn't just been shaken by a child. "You want to stand with us? Let's see how you handle the real drills." Her father glanced at Briggs with a look of warning, but the girl answered before he could intervene. "Show me," she said, the same clear determination in her voice. The words sent another ripple through the group. The SEALs exchanged glances. They had been tested through impossible conditions, pushed until their minds and bodies broke, and now this small girl dared to step into their arena. Some felt a protective instinct to shut this down, to keep the line between their brutal world and the innocence of childhood intact. Others, however, felt a spark of challenge ignite. If she wanted to play, they would show her what it meant. Briggs barked an order, and two men dragged out a weighted rucksack, the kind used for conditioning marches. It was stuffed with gear, easily 40 pounds, more than a third of the girl's body weight. "Strap up," Briggs said, tossing it at her feet. The bag landed with a heavy thud, and a couple of the men chuckled, convinced the test would end here. Her father stepped forward quickly. "That's enough," he warned. "She's not." But she cut him off with a look, the same stubborn spark in her eyes. Without hesitation, she bent down, pulled the straps over her shoulders, and staggered slightly under the sudden weight. Her knees buckled for a second, but she grit her teeth, adjusted, and straightened up, wobbling but standing. The SEALs who had expected her to crumple were stunned into silence again. "Walk the line," Briggs ordered, pointing to the length of the range, nearly 100 yards. The girl took her first step, then another. Each one shaky under the crushing burden, but she did not fall. The men watched as her small boots scuffed against the gravel, her breathing loud and labored but steady. Step after step, she moved forward, her thin arms gripping the straps tightly, her face flushed red with effort. By the halfway mark, sweat was dripping down her forehead, and her legs trembled like reeds in the wind. A couple of SEALs exchanged looks, uncomfortable now, realizing they were pushing her far past what most children could handle. One of them muttered, "She's gonna collapse." But Briggs said nothing, watching intently, his jaw clenched. The girl kept walking. Each step seemed like it would be her last, but she never stopped. Finally, she reached the far end, staggered to a halt, and dropped to her knees, pulling the rucksack off with a groan. She was gasping, her small chest heaving, but when she looked up, her eyes were still burning with determination. "What's next?" she asked hoarsely. The men were floored. No one spoke for several seconds, the sound of cicadas in the distance filling the void. Then came a low chuckle, not mocking this time but impressed. "She's got guts," one of the younger SEALs admitted. Another, still skeptical, said, "But guts aren't enough. Let's see skill." They led her to the obstacle course, a grueling series of walls, ropes, and mud pits designed to punish even the strongest trainees. The girl's father looked torn between stepping in and letting her prove herself, but in the end he remained silent, knowing she wouldn't forgive him if he interfered. The SEALs explained the course quickly, expecting her to balk, but she only nodded. "All right," Briggs growled. "Let's see you move." She launched herself forward, her small frame darting across the ground. She reached the first wall, leapt and scrambled halfway up before slipping. The men smirked, certain she was finished, but she dug her fingers into the wood, hauled herself up with raw determination, and rolled over the top. Her landings were clumsy, her movements unpolished, but her willpower carried her through. She swung on ropes, crawled through mud, and dragged herself under barbed wire. Each task battered her body, scraping her arms and caking her in dirt, yet she pressed on. By the time she reached the finish, her clothes were soaked, her hands bleeding, and her breaths ragged, but she was smiling, an exhausted, triumphant smile that silenced every doubt. Briggs stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "Not bad," he said grudgingly. "Not bad at all." Around him, the others muttered in agreement, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others hiding smirks of admiration. The girl stood tall, battered but unbroken, and repeated the question that had already become her challenge. "What's next?" The sun had shifted higher in the sky, burning down on the training ground, but no one seemed to notice anymore. The girl stood before the Navy SEALs caked in mud, her hands raw, sweat dripping from every inch of her small frame. But her eyes, those eyes were alive, steady, unshaken. The men who had once laughed and dismissed her, now watched with a quiet, reluctant respect. She had walked their rucksack line, conquered their obstacle course, and still she stood, asking for more. The silence stretched until Briggs finally cleared his throat. "Fine," he said, his gravel voice cutting through the air. "You want the next test? Let's see if you can actually shoot like a SEAL. Targets at 300 yards. Time limit, 60 seconds. 10 shots." He gave her a hard look, one that held no mercy. "Hit at least 7 or you fail. That's the standard. Even half these guys choke on this drill." A murmur rippled through the group. This was no child's game. This was the kind of precision marksmanship that separated the elite from everyone else. The girl wiped her muddy hands on her pants, then walked toward the firing line. Her father stepped forward, unable to stop himself this time. "That's enough, Briggs," he snapped. "She's proven her point." But before Briggs could answer, the girl looked up at her father and shook her head. "Dad," she said softly, though the steel in her voice rang clear, "let me try." He stared at her for a long moment, torn between protection and pride, then stepped back, his jaw tight. Briggs gestured to one of the men who brought over a precision rifle, a heavy, customized weapon designed for long-range engagement. It was easily as long as she was tall, and several SEALs smirked, confident the weight alone would stop her. But she took it without complaint, knelt on the mat, and adjusted it the way she had seen her father do in their backyard countless times. The rifle wobbled in her small arms, but she steadied it against her shoulder, her cheek pressing firmly against the stock. "Shooter ready?" the instructor barked. She nodded once. "On the buzzer." The sharp beep sounded, and the girl inhaled deeply, her tiny chest rising as she aligned her sights. The first shot cracked, echoing across the range. The round struck the target, clean center mass. A ripple went through the SEALs. She chambered the next round, her motions slow but deliberate, and fired again. Another hit just off the bullseye. Shot 3. Shot 4. Each round landed within the kill zone. Time ticked down mercilessly, the seconds bleeding away, but she didn't panic. Her breathing was controlled, her trigger squeeze steady, her focus unbreakable. By the 8th shot, she had scored a cluster so tight that even seasoned shooters would have been proud. The 9th struck just left of the bullseye. With seconds to spare, she lined up the 10th and final shot. The rifle barked, and the round punched directly into the center, dead on. The buzzer sounded, signaling the end of the drill. The range was silent again, but this silence was different. It wasn't disbelief, it was awe. 10 shots, 10 hits in under 60 seconds. Not only had she met the SEAL standard, she had exceeded it, shattering the record for precision under time pressure. A couple of men swore under their breath. One of the younger operators ran forward to check the target, then held it up, his voice incredulous. "All 10 hits. Tight grouping. No misses." He turned to Briggs. "Sir, she just smoked the drill." Briggs' jaw flexed, his eyes narrowed. He wanted to believe it was luck, a freak accident, but he knew better. No one got that lucky, not 10 times in a row under pressure. He studied the girl for a long moment before finally nodding once. "Not bad, kid," he muttered. But the way his eyes lingered on her betrayed something else, respect and maybe even the faintest edge of fear. The girl lowered the rifle, her small arms trembling from the effort, but she stood tall, dirt-streaked and unflinching. "What's next?" she asked again, her voice hoarse but steady. The SEALs glanced at one another. This was no ordinary child. They were beginning to realize that every test they gave her, she not only passed but dominated. Some of them began whispering, recalling stories of prodigies, of rare individuals who seemed born for combat and discipline. Her father remained silent, though inside his chest his heart pounded with a strange mix of dread and overwhelming pride. He had always known she was special, but watching her dismantle one of the hardest drills in SEAL training with childlike calm was beyond anything he had imagined. The murmurs among the men turned into something sharper, a challenge. They weren't ready to be bested so easily, not on their own ground. One of the SEALs, a wiry sniper named Rourke, stepped forward. "All right, little sharpshooter," he said, his tone more serious than mocking now. "You want the next level? Try running the combat course. Moving targets, multiple ranges, time sprints. This one breaks grown men." He crossed his arms, confident that this would end the spectacle once and for all. But the girl only gave that same fearless nod. "Show me," she said. The combat course stretched across the far side of the compound, a maze of barriers, moving steel silhouettes and pop-up targets designed to simulate real combat scenarios. It was the kind of drill that demanded not just accuracy but speed, endurance, and split-second decision-making. Even the most seasoned SEALs struggled with it, and rookies often washed out before finishing. The men led her to the starting line, their expressions mixed with skepticism and anticipation. Some still believed the course would crush her. Others, quieter now, had begun to wonder if they were witnessing something far greater than a child's determination. The girl stood at the line, dwarfed by the walls and barricades ahead. She was still streaked with mud, her hands raw from the obstacle course, her arms sore from the rifle drills. Yet when the instructor explained the rules, 30 targets, 300 yards of sprinting, 10 obstacles, all under 5 minutes, she didn't flinch. She listened carefully, nodding once, her focus so sharp that even the hardened operators could feel it. One muttered under his breath, "She's not scared." Another replied quietly, "She doesn't know how to be." Her father stood off to the side, tense, torn between stepping in and letting her prove herself. But he stayed silent. He knew this was bigger than his protection now. She wasn't just testing herself, she was forcing an entire brotherhood of warriors to confront the impossible. The buzzer sounded. She exploded forward, small legs pumping, rifle clutched tight. The first target popped up at 20 yards. She fired instinctively, the round slamming center mass before the steel plate dropped. Without pausing, she sprinted to the next cover point, dropped to a knee, and engaged 2 more targets in quick succession. The rifle barked, brass casings spilled across the gravel, and each round struck true. The SEALs leaned forward unconsciously, drawn in despite themselves. Obstacle 1, a low wall. She vaulted, scrambled awkwardly but made it over. Obstacle 2, barbed wire crawl. She hit the dirt, slid under, her small frame giving her an advantage as she wriggled through faster than many grown men. Another target popped up to her left. She swung the rifle and fired mid-crawl, dropping it cleanly. The observers swore under their breath. She wasn't just hitting targets, she was flowing through the course with an uncanny rhythm, as if the chaos was her natural element. Halfway through, sweat drenched her, her breaths came ragged, but her pace never slowed. She shot moving targets at 50 yards, then sprinted to a tower, climbed 3 flights of stairs 2 steps at a time, and engaged distant silhouettes from the high platform. Each shot cracked sharp and precise, dropping targets one after another. Rourke, the wiry sniper who had issued the challenge, narrowed his eyes. He had seen prodigies, marksmen who could shoot the wings off a fly, but none with her speed under pressure. She wasn't hesitating, wasn't second-guessing, her mind and body were locked in perfect synchronicity. By the final stretch, the crowd of SEALs had grown silent, the only sounds the thud of her boots, the rasp of her breathing, and the sharp thunder of rifle fire. She sprinted into the last gauntlet, where 5 pop-up targets rose in rapid succession at random intervals. Most trainees cracked here, missing 1 or 2 in the chaos. She snapped her rifle up, fired once, twice, 3 times for 5. The plates all dropped in perfect rhythm, each hit a kill shot. The buzzer screamed just as her last casing clattered to the ground. The timer stopped at 3 minutes, 42 seconds. There was a pause, long, heavy, unreal, before one of the instructors checked the data and spoke, his voice low but carrying across the field. 30 out of 30. Time, 3:42. That's a record. The men erupted in shouts, curses, disbelief. Some paced in circles, shaking their heads. Others laughed in astonishment. A few just stood frozen, staring at her as if they couldn't trust their own eyes. This course had broken men twice her size, and she had just shattered every SEAL record ever set on it. Her father felt his throat tighten, emotion swelling against his chest. Pride, fear, awe, it was all tangled together, leaving him breathless. He knew what those numbers meant, what her performance meant. His daughter had just done the impossible in front of the most elite warriors on Earth. The girl herself collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her small chest heaving. She was drenched in sweat, her arms shaking violently from the recoil and the run, but her face was lit with a fierce, victorious smile. She wiped her brow, looked up at Briggs and Rourke and whispered hoarsely, "What's next?" That single question echoed like a thunderclap across the range. The men exchanged glances, some amused, some unsettled, some deeply impressed. Briggs, the veteran, rubbed his jaw slowly, his stern face betraying a flicker of a grin. "Kid," he muttered, "there may not be a next. You just smoked the best we've got." But even as he said it, another thought rippled through the group, unspoken but undeniable. If she could do this now, at her age, what would she become in 10 years? In 20? The question lingered in every mind as they stared at the small girl who had come to the range asking to fire and ended up rewriting the very meaning of their standards. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on the compound, but the atmosphere around the SEALs felt charged, almost electric. The girl had just shattered every record on the combat course, leaving hardened warriors stunned and silent. Some of the men still shook their heads, muttering about flukes or luck, but most had already accepted the truth. This child was no ordinary girl. She had a will that refused to bend, a focus sharper than steel, and a fire that made even battle-hardened veterans uneasy. Briggs stood at the front of the group, his face unreadable as he looked at her, still kneeling in the dirt, gasping for air but grinning like she'd conquered the world. "She's tough," one SEAL admitted quietly. Another muttered, "Tougher than half the rookies I've seen." But Briggs wasn't finished. He had watched too many candidates breeze through one stage only to shatter in the next. The battlefield didn't just demand skill or speed, it demanded an unbreakable mind. He raised a hand, silencing the whispers. "All right," he said, his gravelly voice carrying authority. "Shooting and running are one thing. But this is where warriors break. Let's see if she can handle it." He motioned toward the infamous endurance gauntlet. Drown-proofing drills, ice baths, and mental torture designed to push men past their breaking points. Several SEALs frowned uneasily. Putting a grown man through this was brutal. Putting a child through it was unthinkable. "Briggs," her father snapped, stepping forward, his tone sharp with warning. "That's enough. She's not your trainee. She's a kid." But before Briggs could reply, the girl staggered to her feet, swaying slightly but standing firm. She wiped the sweat from her brow with a trembling hand and said in a hoarse but unwavering voice, "I can handle it." The words silenced even her father. He wanted to argue, to pull her out, but the look in her eyes, the look of someone who knew exactly what she was saying, froze him. Briggs studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Fine," he said. "We'll start with the tank." They moved to the deep training pool where drown-proofing was carried out. The drill was infamous. Hands and feet bound, candidates thrown into the water and forced to survive by bobbing, flipping, or controlled breathing. Many men panicked within minutes, thrashing until instructors yanked them out. Even those who passed described it as the most terrifying ordeal of their training. As the SEALs bound the girl's wrists and ankles, several muttered under their breath, "This is insane. She's too small. She's gonna sink." But the girl didn't complain, didn't flinch. She simply nodded when Briggs asked, "Ready?" Then, without hesitation, she was dropped into the water. At once, the surface closed over her head, and she disappeared into the depths. The men leaned forward instinctively, watching the ripples with held breath. 10 seconds passed. 15. Then she bobbed up, her chest rising as she took a quick, sharp breath before sinking again. The rhythm began. Down into the silence, then up again, controlled, deliberate. The instructors watched closely, ready to pull her out at the first sign of panic, but it never came. Her body moved with surprising calm, conserving energy, working with the water instead of against it. A full minute passed. 2 minutes. The men exchanged uneasy looks. Some of them hadn't lasted this long in their own trials. At the 3-minute mark, Briggs' brows furrowed. He had seen grown men cry for mercy long before this point. But when the girl surfaced again, her expression wasn't fear, it was focus. She took her breath, sank, then rose again with mechanical precision. Her father's fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding. Every instinct screamed to stop this madness, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. She wasn't drowning, she was enduring. By the 5-minute mark, the pool instructors finally hauled her out, not because she failed but because the men watching were unsettled by how long she had lasted. She collapsed onto the deck, coughing water, her small chest heaving violently. But even as she gasped for air, she grinned, teeth flashing through her exhaustion. "What's next?" she whispered. The men stared in silence. One of them shook his head slowly. "She lasted longer than half my class." Another muttered, "She's not human." Briggs crouched down beside her, his eyes narrowed, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. For the first time, his gravel voice held something other than skepticism. "You've got fight," he admitted. "But fight fades. Pain, cold, fear, they break everyone eventually." He stood, motioned toward the next challenge. The ice pit, a brutal test where candidates were submerged in freezing water, forced to sit motionless for as long as possible. "Let's see how long that fire burns when your body shuts down." The girl didn't hesitate. Her legs wobbled as she stood, but she walked toward the pit without being told, her steps steady despite her exhaustion. The SEALs followed, their expressions a mix of disbelief and grim fascination. No one laughed anymore. No one doubted. They were watching something they couldn't explain, something that defied the limits they had built their careers on. And deep down, some of them felt the beginnings of unease, because if this girl was just getting started, There might not be a next test she couldn't conquer. The storm arrived with a violence no one had expected. Black waves rose like walls in the night, crashing against the steel hull of the ship, rattling bolts loose, spraying salt water over the deck. The sky cracked open with thunder, lightning illuminating the ocean in bursts of silver fury. The recruits clung to the rails, soaked to the bone, their faces pale with exhaustion. This was the infamous Hell Night at sea, a test designed to push even the strongest men past their breaking point. The SEAL instructors barked orders through the storm, their voices nearly drowned by the roar of wind and water. And somewhere in the chaos was that same little girl, no longer little in the eyes of anyone who had trained beside her. Her hair was plastered to her face, her eyes narrowed against the rain, her hands clamped tight to the lifeline running across the ship's side. The task was simple in description but brutal in execution. Navigate a series of small inflatable boats through the raging waters, carrying heavy equipment, and bring every teammate safely to the final checkpoint. The reality was that most teams would not finish. Men were vomiting from seasickness, others slumped unconscious in corners, and more than one candidate begged to quit before the exercise had truly begun. But she didn't waver. She steadied her team, shouting above the storm, her voice cutting clear and sharp despite her smaller frame. She directed the men twice her size, pointing out where to balance, how to lean into the waves, when to row and when to hold. And somehow, impossibly, they listened. Her boat hit the water with a shuddering crash. She went first, diving into the surf without hesitation, pulling at the ropes until the others followed. The waves battered them from all sides, swallowing their boat, tossing them into the troughs, threatening to flip them end over end. Men cursed, one cried out as in or splintered, another lost grip and nearly vanished into the sea before her hand caught his sleeve. With strength born not from size but from refusal to surrender, she dragged him back aboard. The storm howled, the current pushed them off course, but she roared louder than all of it, "Row!" Her teammates dug their oars into the black water, following her rhythm, pulling as one. Other boats capsized. Men clung to wreckage, instructors circling in safety craft to haul them out of the exercise. One by one teams disappeared into failure. But her boat surged forward, steady despite the storm. Every time a wave threatened to bury them, she called for balance. Every time a man faltered, she shouted his name, forced him to focus. Hours passed like this, relentless struggle against nature, against exhaustion, against doubt. And still she did not break. Finally, when the first light of dawn painted the storm clouds in bruised purples and pale gold, her boat slammed against the checkpoint buoy. They had made it. Every man in her team was still aboard, battered but breathing. She was the first to leap out, securing the line with hands torn raw from rope burns. As she planted her feet on the slick deck, the instructors stared in disbelief. Out of all the teams that had begun, only one had finished, and it was hers. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Men too tired to cheer simply stared at her, their eyes wide, their expressions a mix of awe and something like shame. For they remembered the first day when she had stepped forward, barely taller than the rifles they carried, and asked to fire, only to be laughed at. They remembered their doubt, their disbelief, their mocking smiles. And now those same men stood speechless, salt and rain dripping down their faces, while she stood upright, trembling with fatigue but unbowed, her chest rising and falling with stubborn pride. An instructor stepped forward, his face carved from stone, his voice low but carrying. "In all my years," he said, "I've never seen a team finish this evolution without losing at least one man. You brought them all back." He paused, studying her, the smallest figure in the group, yet somehow towering over them all. "You didn't just break the record. You destroyed it." Her knees nearly buckled then, not from weakness but from the weight of the moment. Every bruise, every hour of pain, every humiliation endured, it all surged through her at once. But she didn't collapse. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping across the drenched recruits, across the instructors, across the endless horizon where the storm still lingered. She had proven what no one believed possible, and the fire in her eyes made it clear this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The men who had once laughed were the first to step toward her, some with tears streaking their faces, some with weary smiles, all with respect in their eyes. They placed their hands on her shoulders, on her back, nodding silently, acknowledging her as one of them, not just equal but a leader forged in the very heart of the storm. And as the sun finally broke through the clouds, golden light spilling across the battered sea, she allowed herself a single breath of relief. Then she looked back to the horizon, where more challenges surely waited. The girl who once asked to fire was gone. In her place stood a warrior no storm could ever silence. The hall was electric that night. Word had spread far beyond the base about the girl who had humbled the most elite warriors on Earth with nothing but sheer willpower, unshakable spirit, and impossible results. Every corridor buzzed with whispers of her name, though most still couldn't believe it. A child, barely tall enough to carry a rifle, had achieved what no Navy SEAL, no Green Beret, no commando in the history of the armed forces had ever done. The commanding officers knew this was more than an anomaly, it was a revelation. They had called an assembly, inviting personnel from every division to witness what they now called the proof of the impossible. Emily, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform that looked oversized on her small frame, stood backstage clutching her dog tags, her heart pounding harder than it had during any physical trial. When the curtain opened and she stepped into the glaring lights, a wave of sound crashed into her. Cheers, applause, and even the stomping of boots against the floor. Rows of decorated soldiers, men and women who had stared down wars and horrors, were on their feet for her. She froze for a moment, overwhelmed, but then her eyes found the front row where her mother sat, tears glistening as she smiled with a pride so fierce it made Emily's chest tighten. Behind her were the very SEALs who had once laughed at her request to fire a rifle. They weren't laughing anymore, they were clapping the hardest, some even whistling and grinning with genuine respect. The Admiral walked up beside her, his presence commanding silence. He didn't speak at first, only looked down at her with an expression that was equal parts stern and warm. "This girl," he said, his voice booming through the hall, "has reminded us all what strength truly means. Not muscle, not years of training, but heart, discipline, and the refusal to quit when the world tells you that you can't." His words echoed in the hall, drawing nods from even the toughest men in the room. Emily's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin, determined to meet every gaze without flinching. The Admiral raised her hand high like a champion, and the hall erupted again. Emily felt the sound vibrating in her bones, but this time she didn't shy away. She stood taller, let the weight of their recognition sink into her. For so long she had been dismissed as too young, too small, too fragile. Tonight, none of those words mattered anymore. Tonight, she was the standard others would now be measured against. After the assembly, the SEALs surrounded her. Instead of condescension, their eyes held respect. One of the older ones, his face weathered from years of battle, knelt down to her level and held out his challenge coin. "You earned this," he said simply. Emily hesitated, looking at the small metal token in his palm, knowing how much it meant in military culture. Coins weren't given lightly, they represented loyalty, achievement, and honor. She accepted it with both hands and he smiled. "Don't let anyone tell you limits exist. You erased them." One by one, others came forward, offering handshakes, pats on the back, even quiet words of thanks. She realized then that she had not just proven herself. She had shifted something inside these men and women, reminded them that greatness wasn't bound by age, size, or expectation. Later that night, when the crowd had dispersed and the base quieted, Emily sat outside under the stars with her mother. The desert wind was cool and the world felt still after the chaos of the day. She turned the coin over in her hands, feeling its weight. "Mom," she whispered, "do you think I really deserved all of this? I'm just me." Her mother placed an arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "That's exactly why you deserve it," she said. "Because you never tried to be anything other than yourself. You fought with what you had, your heart, and it was enough to move the unmovable." Emily leaned against her, staring at the constellations. For the first time she allowed herself to believe it. She had dreamed of being recognized, of showing the world she was more than the little girl they dismissed. But she hadn't just earned recognition. She had carved her name into the foundation of a place where legends were made. Every soldier who had seen her would carry her story forward, and somewhere out there, another child who doubted themselves would hear it and believe they could be more. The base lights flickered in the distance, the night carrying the faint hum of generators. Emily clutched the coin to her chest, smiling faintly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new skeptics, and new tests. But tonight she was content. She had proven that laughter could be silenced by perseverance, that disbelief could be turned into respect, and that even a little girl with trembling hands could rewrite the rules of what was possible. The record books might carry her name, but it was the spark she had lit in others that truly mattered. And deep down, Emily knew this was only the beginning of her journey. The crowd that had gathered at the edge of the Navy base's training compound was unlike anything the SEAL instructors had seen before. Officers, enlisted men, recruits, and even family members had all shown up, drawn by the incredible rumors that had spread like wildfire through the ranks. They said the little girl who once stood at the firing range begging to shoot had now broken every record, every benchmark, every wall that had held others back. Some said it was exaggeration. Some said it was impossible. But all of them were there waiting to see if it was true. Emily walked toward the stage, her small boots crunching against the gravel. The air carried an expectant hush. She was not dressed like the others in heavy tactical uniforms or weighted vests. Instead, she wore her modest training clothes, scuffed from days of crawling, swimming, and running, but her posture was upright, her gaze unwavering. Behind her trailed a few of the toughest SEALs in the unit, the very same men who had once laughed at her, men who now carried themselves differently around her. They no longer saw her as a joke or a child. They saw her as someone who had reminded them what strength really was. The commanding officer stepped forward, a silver-haired man with eyes that had measured and broken 100 recruits in his career. His voice carried across the compound as he said, "Today we witness something extraordinary. Records are numbers. Titles are words. But what this girl has shown us cannot be confined to either. She has demonstrated heart, resilience, and courage at a level that humbles even us." He paused, looking at Emily with the faintest smile. "And she has done what many thought was impossible." There was a silence, and then a roar of applause erupted, breaking the formal military decorum. Emily stood still, her chin lifted but her eyes wide at the sound of so many voices cheering for her. She wasn't used to applause. She was used to working in silence, pushing her body until it nearly broke, enduring the water, the mud, the pain. This moment felt surreal, but she held herself steady, because that was who she had become. The instructors began reading out her achievements. One by one, the numbers echoed like thunder through the compound. She had swum the endurance course faster than any SEAL candidate in history. She had carried more weight, run farther, shot tighter groups, and executed tactical drills with a level of instinct no one could match. She had passed every test not just as well as the men before her, but better, setting new standards. From this day forward, the officer declared, every recruit who enters this program will measure themselves against her records. She has raised the bar for us all. The same men who had once rolled their eyes at her now stood at the edge of the stage, eyes shining with respect. One of them, a battle-hardened veteran who had seen more tours than he could count, walked up and raised his hand to her. Emily hesitated, then shook it. The veteran's grip was firm, but it was his words that struck her. "You reminded us why we do this. Not for pride, not for the name, but for the fight inside." Others nodded, and slowly they too stepped forward, each one giving a salute, a handshake, or a quiet nod of acknowledgement. Emily felt something inside her shift. She had come here just to prove she could belong, to show that their laughter had been misplaced. But what she had done had grown far beyond that. She hadn't just earned a place, she had created a new path. When the cheering died down, she was asked to speak. Emily stepped up to the microphone, the sea of uniforms blurring before her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice carried clear. "I came here because I was told I couldn't. Because people laughed at me. Because they said I was too small, too weak, too young. I wanted to prove them wrong, but somewhere along the way I realized it wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about proving myself right." She paused, her eyes glancing at the SEALs. "Strength isn't about size. It isn't about being born tough. It's about choosing not to quit, no matter how many times you fall, no matter how hard the world tells you to stop. I don't stand here as a soldier or a legend. I stand here as proof that heart can shatter walls that strength alone never could." The silence after her words was deep, and then the applause rose again, louder, fiercer, carrying with it the weight of belief. Some men even removed their caps in respect. That night, when Emily sat alone under the stars, the noise of the day still echoing in her chest, she finally let herself smile. She thought of the first day standing by the firing range, mocked and dismissed. She thought of the icy water, the mud, the bruises, the burning lungs. She thought of the moment she almost quit. And then she thought of the men who now looked at her not as an outsider, but as an equal, even as a leader in her own way. She understood then that what she had broken wasn't just records, it was doubt. She had torn down the invisible wall that said only certain people could rise, only certain people could achieve. And in its place she had left behind a legacy. Years later, recruits would still whisper about her during their hardest days. They would point at the numbers etched on the training walls and remind each other, if she could do it, so can we. And though Emily never sought glory, never wanted fame, her story became something greater than her, a beacon for anyone who was ever told they couldn't. And somewhere, deep in her heart, the little girl who once asked to fire a rifle smiled, because she knew she had never stopped fighting and she never would. The end.